Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
In 1944, Eva and Leon Munzer, two young Jewish girls trying to escape Nazi persecution, were betrayed by those who were supposed to protect them. During an argument between the couple sheltering them, the husband reported the children and his own wife to the authorities. As a result of this betrayal, the girls were sent to the Auschwitz extermination camp, where they lost their lives. Family members say goodbye to a child who would be sent to death through the fence of the central prison in the Lodz ghetto, Poland, in September 1942. In this prison, children, the sick, and the elderly were held before being deported to the Chelmno extermination camp as part of the operation called Gesperre. Children with shaved heads are lined up under the watchful eyes of guards at a concentration camp during World War II. Many of these children were separated from their families and subjected to inhumane conditions, including hunger, mistreatment, and forced labor. This type of scene was common in Nazi extermination and concentration camps, where Jews, Roma, and other minorities were imprisoned. At the Dachau concentration camp in Germany, doctors conduct a brutal experiment on a camp prisoner. The prisoner is dressed in a special suit and submerged in a tank of near-freezing water as part of a series of experiments designed to test the human body's resistance to cold water. A skeletal survivor is carried out of the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland shortly after its liberation by Allied forces. The rescued person is visibly weak, representing the state of extreme malnutrition and mistreatment many prisoners faced in Nazi concentration camps. The liberation of the camp in January 1945 revealed to the world the atrocities committed by the Nazis. Two Jewish boys, visibly malnourished and wearing worn-out clothing, rest on an improvised structure after the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. Thousands of Jewish children were imprisoned, and many did not survive the cruel conditions of the camp. Jewish prisoners are piled onto bunks inside the Buchenwald concentration camp located near Weimar, Germany. The man standing, his body severely debilitated, is one of the camp's survivors. Living conditions were inhumane, and many prisoners suffered from extreme hunger, diseases, and mistreatment. Buchenwald was one of the largest concentration camps on German soil, and a few days after this photo was taken, the camp was liberated by Allied forces. A victim of a Nazi medical experiment is forced into a container of near-freezing water at the Dachau concentration camp in 1942. Under the supervision of the monstrous SS doctor Sigmund Rascher, this brutal experiment aimed to study the effects of hypothermia on humans in an attempt to understand how German soldiers could survive in extreme conditions. These inhumane experiments, which caused great suffering and death for many victims, are part of the war crimes committed by the Nazis during the Holocaust. Nurses care for an extremely frail Russian Jewish prisoner, a survivor of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany. This camp, initially created as a prisoner of war camp, became a site of extermination and mistreatment under the Nazi regime. Bergen-Belsen was liberated in April 1945, revealing horrific scenes of starvation, disease, and death. In this photo, scratch marks are seen on a wall in a gas chamber at a Nazi concentration camp, bearing witness to the final moments of condemned prisoners. These marks are visceral evidence of the desperation of those who, realizing they were being led to their deaths, tried in vain to escape their tragic fate. The gas chambers were one of the cruelest tools used by the Nazis to exterminate millions of people, mainly Jews, during the Holocaust. The face of a young girl shows the scars of a terrible beating she endured at the hands of Nazi guards in a concentration camp. Her wounds are still covered with makeshift bandages, evidencing the brutality and suffering she, like many others, faced. Jewish women prepare a simple meal amid the chaos, with a pile of shoes in the background, belonging to prisoners who died at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp around 1940. These women, dressed in the striped uniforms of prisoners, fought to survive in a devastating reality where each small act of cooking represented a form of resistance and hope in the face of Nazi brutality. In this 1945 photo, British soldiers, wearing protective clothing, remove bodies of victims from the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany. After the camp's liberation, the Allies were confronted with horrific scenes of thousands of prisoners who had died from starvation, disease, and mistreatment. The special clothing was necessary to avoid contamination by diseases like typhus, which ravaged the camp in its final months of operation. In this photo, two Jewish girls wearing yellow stars sewn onto their clothing wait with serious expressions during a moment of deportation in Nazi-occupied Europe. These yellow stars were mandatory to identify Jews under the Nazi regime. Many of these children were sent to concentration or extermination camps, such as Auschwitz, where they faced inhumane conditions and in many cases did not survive. The image shows the interior of the crematorium at the Dachau concentration camp in Germany, shortly after the camp's liberation on April 29, 1945. The crematorium was used to incinerate the bodies of prisoners who had died as a result of the harsh living conditions, starvation, diseases, and summary executions. Beatrix Westheimer and her cousin Henry Hurwitz stand next to Catholic priest Adeline Vai in the photo, taken in May 1943 in Ottigny, Belgium, on the occasion of Beatrix's First Communion. Some Jewish children were able to survive the Holocaust because they were protected by charitable people and institutions from other religions. The children quickly learned the prayers and rituals of their new religion to keep their Jewish identity hidden, even from their closest friends. In this 1945 photo, concentration camp prisoners watch as doctors treat a severely malnourished survivor shortly after the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen camp in Germany. The patient, lying on a stretcher, shows extreme signs of starvation, a reflection of the brutal conditions in which prisoners were kept. After the liberation by Allied forces, medical teams were sent to provide immediate aid to the few survivors, many of whom were on the brink of death due to prolonged starvation. In this photo, taken shortly after the liberation of a Nazi concentration camp in 1945, an extremely malnourished prisoner leans against a bunk inside one of the overcrowded barracks. Struggling to stand due to extreme malnutrition, he is pictured in Buchenwald, Germany in 1944. 10a. In 1942, Jewish women and children were forced to board trains bound for extermination camps in Eastern Europe as part of the Nazis' genocidal policy. Under inhumane conditions, they were deported in overcrowded freight cars, unaware they were being taken to their deaths. These trains were part of the implementation of the final solution. 11b. Nazi officers supervised the boarding of Jewish prisoners onto a train, which will depart for concentration or extermination camps in Eastern Europe. These mass deportations were central to the implementation of the final solution, the Nazi plan for the systematic extermination of the Jewish population. Prisoners, often crammed into freight cars, faced long, inhumane journeys without food or water, resulting in the deaths of many during the trip. A prisoner subjected to low-pressure experiments. These experiments, conducted for the benefit of the Luftwaffe, recreated atmospheric pressures similar to those found at 50,000 feet. The goal was to test the survival limits of German pilots at high altitudes and determine how far they could fly safely. Many prisoners, like the one in the image, were exposed to extreme conditions, resulting in severe physical damage and, in many cases, death. A survivor of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp is portrayed shortly after the camp's liberation by Allied troops. Bergen-Belsen, Germany. In a state of extreme fragility, the prisoner survived the camp's terrible conditions, where hunger, disease, and suffering were present every day. Jewish children lived under the protection of the Maison des Roches, a residence led by the courageous Daniel Trocmé, in the background, center, wearing glasses. He, along with other residents of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, France, risked their lives to shelter and protect Jews during the Nazi occupation. A starving prisoner is carried in the arms of another prisoner, shortly before being taken to a hospital for medical treatment on May 4, 1945, at the Wöbbelin concentration camp, Germany. When United States troops arrived at the scene, they found prisoners on the brink of death, victims of extreme hunger, and the inhumane conditions imposed by the Nazi regime. Jacqueline Morgenstern was only 7 years old when this photo was taken in Paris, France in 1940. She was an innocent girl who was later forced to endure the horrors of the Neuengamme concentration camp, where she was a victim of cruel medical experiments involving tuberculosis conducted by the Nazis. Jacqueline was murdered shortly before the camp's liberation. A Soviet prisoner of war, a victim of a Nazi medical experiment on tuberculosis at the Neuengamme concentration camp in Germany, late 1944. These experiments were part of the cruel and inhumane testing carried out by the Nazis, who subjected prisoners to extreme conditions and dangerous tests without consent, causing suffering and death. Extremely malnourished prisoners wait sitting on steps at the Dachau concentration camp in Germany, shortly after liberation by Allied forces. Their thin bodies and faces marked by suffering reflect the horrors they endured under the Nazi regime, where hunger, forced labor, and disease were constant. After years of mistreatment, they were finally free, but gravely affected by the inhumane conditions they had endured. A Jewish child was forced to pose for a photo showing the scar resulting from the removal of her lymph nodes by SS doctors. She was part of a group of 20 Jewish children who were cruelly injected with tuberculosis germs as part of a Nazi medical experiment. All these children were brutally murdered on April 20, 1945, just days before the end of the war, in an attempt to cover up the horrors and crimes committed in the concentration camps. After the liberation of the Flossenburg concentration camp, 2 infantry soldiers from the United States Army examine a large pile of shoes that belonged to the camp's victims. This image is a devastating portrait of the atrocities committed by the Nazis, symbolizing the countless lost lives and the suffering of the people who were murdered in that place. This photo shows Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany who tried to find shelter in Cuba and the United States. Unfortunately, after a journey full of hope, they were forced to return to Europe when these countries denied them asylum. Of the 937 passengers aboard, most were Jews fleeing the growing persecution under the Nazi regime. This tragic episode, known as the Voyage of the Damned, became a symbol of the international rejection that many Jews faced during the Holocaust. In this photo, taken in 1944, Jewish prisoners stand behind a barbed wire fence at the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, located in Poland, which was occupied by Nazi Germany. They hold empty bowls, reflecting the severe hunger they were facing. Auschwitz, one of the largest and most brutal camps, was a central part of the Holocaust, where millions of Jews and other minorities were murdered in mass. Young Jewish refugees at a children's home, rescued through the efforts of the OSE, Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, and the American Friends Service Committee, organizations that worked tirelessly to save Jewish children from the horrors of Nazi persecution during World War II. The home offered shelter and protection to many, giving them a chance to survive and preserving their lives at a time of extreme vulnerability. The image shows prisoners at a Nazi concentration camp, where one prisoner is seen cutting the hair of another. The striped uniforms they both wear are typical of prisoners in camps like Auschwitz and other Nazi concentration camps. This practice was common in the camps, both for hygiene reasons and to dehumanize and subjugate the prisoners. Soviet prisoners of war in the Mauthausen concentration camp, Austria, in January 1942. The conditions were brutal, with extreme deprivations, exhausting forced labor, and constant violence. Many of these prisoners were subjected to severe malnutrition, torture, and executions. Mauthausen was known for its cruelty, being one of the deadliest locations in the Nazi camp network, where thousands of prisoners, including Soviets, lost their lives. Gertruda Babulinska appears next to Michael Stolowitsky, a young Jewish boy she hid during the Nazi occupation. For her bravery and compassion, Gertruda was recognized by the Yad Vashem Institute as Righteous Among the Nations, an honor given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. A Roma man, a victim of cruel Nazi medical experiments, was subjected to tests at the Dachau concentration camp in 1944, aimed at attempting to transform seawater into drinkable water. These inhumane experiments were part of the Nazis' efforts to find extreme solutions for their needs during the war. Female survivors, huddled in makeshift barracks for prisoners, appear in the photo shortly after the liberation of the Auschwitz extermination camp by Soviet forces. This scene was recorded in Auschwitz, Poland in 1945. The overcrowded and unsanitary barracks housed women who had suffered the devastating impact of starvation, disease, and forced labor. In April 1945, newly liberated female prisoners from the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany huddle in an improvised shelter. Visibly exhausted and malnourished, many of the women show clear signs of physical and psychological suffering. Bergen-Belsen was known for its inhumane conditions, where starvation and disease claimed the lives of thousands of prisoners. After the camp's liberation by Allied forces, the scenes of devastation shocked the world. An elderly Jewish woman, wrapped in a blanket, looks at the camera with an expression of fear and exhaustion. She is in a concentration camp shortly after liberation, surrounded by other similarly weakened survivors. Her fragile appearance and the white scarf covering her head reflect the years of suffering and deprivation she endured under the Nazi regime. Jewish women from sub-Carpathian Russia, selected for forced labor at Auschwitz-Birkenau, wait to be taken to another section of the camp. These women were part of a group of prisoners destined to perform exhausting labor under inhumane conditions in the concentration camp. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest and most notorious Nazi extermination camp, was not only the site of genocide but also of mass forced labor, where millions of prisoners were subjected to brutal conditions until the end of their lives. The accused in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp trial sit side by side, awaiting judicial proceedings. The trial took place in 1945, when Nazi guards and officers were held accountable for the crimes committed in the camp. The scene shows an important moment of justice being served after the end of World War II, as those responsible for atrocities faced the legal consequences of their brutal actions. Jadwiga Zito, a survivor of the Ravensbrück concentration camp, shows her scars on her leg during the Nuremberg trials. A doctor explains to the court the inhumane procedures and medical experiments to which she was subjected at the camp on November 22, 1942. These cruel experiments, which included the injection of highly pathogenic bacteria, were conducted by Nazi doctors Herta Oberheiser and Fritz Ernst Fischer. Jewish prisoners are captured and surrendered by the Nazis during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943. This uprising was a desperate attempt to resist mass deportation to extermination camps. Men, women, and children bravely fought against the Nazi forces, but in the end, the ghetto was crushed. Many who were not killed in combat ended up being sent to concentration camps. In a displaced persons camp, Jewish survivors post signs asking Britain to allow their immigration to the area under the British Mandate, known as Palestine since antiquity by the Romans, as a punishment to the Jews. These signs represent the survivors' plea for a return to their ancestral land, seeking to leave behind war-torn Europe. The request was based on the League of Nations mandate, which had already established Palestine as a destination for the formation of a Jewish national home. In this photo, taken in the Warsaw Ghetto, Poland, a group of Jews, including a woman and a child, is captured by Nazi soldiers during the violent liquidation of the ghetto. With their hands raised in surrender, these people are being forced to leave their homes to be deported to concentration or extermination camps. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which took place that year, was an act of resistance against the Nazi occupation, but was brutally suppressed. Joseph Kramer, commander of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, is guarded by 2 British soldiers after his capture. Known as the Butcher of Belsen, Kramer was responsible for numerous atrocities committed against the camp's prisoners. After the camp's liberation by Allied forces, he was tried for war crimes, found guilty, and later hanged. A mass grave labeled Grave Natu, containing the remains of 5,000 victims at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany. After the camp's liberation in April 1945, Allied troops found thousands of bodies of prisoners who had died due to starvation, disease, and mistreatment. Mass burials were a necessary measure to deal with the large number of dead, as the camp's conditions were extremely precarious. United States Army Corporal Larry Matinsk places cigarettes into the outstretched hands of newly liberated prisoners who are behind a fence at the Allach concentration camp. Allach, a subcamp of Dachau, was liberated by Allied forces in 1945, and the prisoners, after years of mistreatment, were receiving their first aid. Matinsk's gesture, though simple, represented a moment of humanity and relief for those who had survived under inhumane conditions. Bert and Anne Bochove, a Dutch couple who risked their lives to hide 37 Jews during the Nazi occupation in World War II. Operating under constant threat of being discovered, they turned their pharmacy and home into a safe haven for those persecuted by the Nazi regime. After the war, the couple was recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Israel, in honor of their heroic act. 33rd slide from an educational presentation of the Hitler Youth titled "Germany Surpasses the Jews," related to the Nuremberg Laws, enacted by the Nazi regime in 1935. The text says, "To protect German blood from mixing with foreign races, the Führer promulgated the Nuremberg Laws." This is a diagram used in Nazi concentration camps to identify prisoners according to the color and shape of the triangles they wore on their uniforms. Each color indicated the reason for imprisonment, and the combinations of shapes and colors revealed additional details about the prisoner's status. These markers helped guards categorize and treat prisoners according to their designations in the rigid and brutal camp system. Red triangle, political prisoners. Yellow triangle, Jews, often combined with other symbols. Green triangle, common criminals. Purple triangle, Jehovah's Witnesses. Pink triangle, homosexual prisoners. Black triangle, people labeled as antisocial, including Roma, disabled individuals, and other minorities. A Holocaust survivor cries during a ceremony at the former Nazi extermination camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau in Oświęcim, Poland, on January 27, 2020. This date marks the 75th anniversary of Auschwitz's liberation by Soviet forces, a moment of deep remembrance and reflection on the atrocities committed during the Holocaust. The ceremony brought together survivors, world leaders, and other participants to honor the victims and highlight the importance of preserving the memory of these tragic events, ensuring such horrors are never repeated. One of the first Nazi extermination sites, it is one of the gas chambers located in Hadamar, Germany, where prisoners and people with physical and mental disabilities were systematically murdered as part of the Nazi euthanasia program known as Action T4. This program targeted individuals deemed unworthy of life by the Nazis. Female prisoners at the Ravensbrück concentration camp are forced to perform heavy outdoor labor, digging into the ground under inhumane conditions. The women are wearing the typical striped uniforms of concentration camps. The scene depicts the terrible conditions these people were subjected to, often forced to carry out exhausting labor without the slightest dignity or consideration for their lives. In this 1941 photo, Jewish prisoners are lined up wearing striped uniforms at the Dachau concentration camp in Germany. Dachau was the first Nazi concentration camp, opened in 1933, and served as a model for other camps that would emerge during the Holocaust. Prisoners were forced to work under inhumane conditions and suffered from hunger, cold, and violence. These striped uniforms, with colored triangles identifying prisoners by ethnicity or crime, were a stark reminder of their status. Prisoners from the Mauthausen concentration camp celebrate the arrival of United States troops who liberated the camp on May 5, 1945. After years of oppression and inhumane conditions, they finally regained their freedom. The anti-fascist flag in the crowd marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in history. Survivors of the unimaginable horrors of Dachau, one of the most brutal Nazi concentration camps, line up eagerly at the electric fences to greet soldiers from the 42nd United States Rainbow Division, known as the Yankees, who brought their long-awaited liberation. The image shows the entrance to the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration and extermination camp in Poland in 1945. The snow-covered railroad tracks, which brought prisoners directly into the camp, lead to the imposing main gate, known as the Gate of Death. In the foreground, a large pile of personal belongings, likely from the deported, serves as a tragic reminder of the countless lives cut short. Jewish refugees board the SS Muzinho ship bound for the United States in Lisbon, Portugal, around June 10, 1941. Among the passengers is a group of Jewish children who were recently rescued from an internment camp in France. Born in 1914, the Italian Gino Bartali won several international cycling titles, but his talent on two wheels also had another use: helping persecuted Jews during World War II. Bartali helped about 800 people of Jewish origin escape from Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime. His most common strategy of contribution was to transport documents under the bicycle seat, which would be used for the falsification of Jewish identity papers, but there was more to it than that. Prisoners from the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in Germany march in uniform lines. The camp, located north of Berlin, was built by the Nazis in 1936 and housed tens of thousands of prisoners, including Jews, communists, Roma people, and other persecuted groups. Prisoners were subjected to long hours of forced labor, often in inhumane conditions, which resulted in hunger and death. Sachsenhausen was also used as a training camp for the SS, becoming one of the most brutal of the Nazi regime. In this 1940 photo, French Jews are being escorted by Nazi officers through the streets of Paris during the first mass deportations. This image represents the beginning of the systematic persecution of Jews in occupied France, where thousands were arrested and sent to concentration and extermination camps. Under the Vichy regime, French collaborators helped implement the Nazis' anti-Semitic policies. On May 22, 1940, 490 people from Romani families in the southwestern border region of Germany were deported by the Nazis to occupied Poland. These families were forced to leave their homes, gathered, and transported on trains to forced labor or extermination camps. The deportations were part of the Nazi policy of persecution against minorities, including the Roma, who were targeted for discrimination and violence. A line of prisoners arrives at the Belzec extermination camp in Poland in 1942. Belzec was one of the deadliest extermination camps during the Holocaust, part of Operation Reinhard, where hundreds of thousands of Jews were murdered in gas chambers. For many, arriving at Belzec meant the tragic and cruel end of their lives, with very few survivors left to tell what happened there. Josef Gabčík was a courageous Czech resistance fighter and paratrooper who played a vital role in the fight against Nazism. He is especially known for his participation in the operation that resulted in the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the feared Nazi governor of Bohemia and Moravia, also known as the Butcher of Prague. German Jewish refugees disembark at the port of Shanghai, one of the few places in the world that did not require an entry visa, offering a temporary refuge during the Nazi persecution. Amid drums and barrels, these refugees arrive in Shanghai, China in 1940, fleeing the atrocities of Europe in search of safety. For many, Shanghai became an improvised shelter during the dark years of the Holocaust. 2 Jewish prisoners work on making shoes inside a Nazi concentration camp. The concentration camps often forced prisoners to carry out slave labor in workshops like this, where they produced goods for the German war effort, or for use within the camp. Dr. Joseph Joxy risked his life to save 25 Jews during World War II. He provided safe hiding places, money, medicine, and false identification papers to help them escape Nazi persecution. For his courageous and selfless acts, Joxy was recognized as righteous among the nations by the Yad Vashem Institute. Photo at the refugee camp of Kloster Indersdorf in Germany in 1945 shows Sinaida Grossman holding a business card with her name. The card was created so that any surviving relatives could find her after the end of the Second World War. Kloster Indersdorf was transformed into a refugee camp by the International Red Cross and the Allied forces, with the aim of reuniting families and caring for children who survived the Holocaust. Photo taken during the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany in 1945. After the Allied forces liberated the camp, shocking scenes like this revealed the extreme and inhumane conditions the victims faced. Bergen-Belsen, originally built as a camp for prisoners of war, became a place of suffering and death for thousands of Jewish people and other prisoners during the Holocaust. The Allied forces, upon finding the survivors and the remains of the victims, documented these images to show the horrors committed and to ensure that the world would never forget.